Hi everyone, welcome back to day 3 of our Scanning the Horizon annual meeting. I'm Vicky Tung, the Programme Manager for Futures and Innovation here at the Centre, and you're joining us for our final session currently of exploring the interconnectedness of global trends. So for those of us who are joining us for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Scanning the Horizon is a cross-sector community of trend scanners, global strategists and foresighters, and we have been making megatrends more manageable since 2015. So our agenda for today is, we ended yesterday talking about assets and opportunities for collaboration, and that's really the spirit of where we want to start today. So one strong asset we have is peer organisations which are monitoring trends and signals of change on critical issues which are affecting us all and sharing their insights with us on that. And so I'm really pleased that we've got Civicus and MobLab performing that function for the first section. There'll be room for Q&A with Mandeep and Michael. Then we will present, Arati and I will present one easy opportunity for collaboration we're already designing, which is for collective open source signal scanning for post-COVID-19, which we will launch from June. And we would really like your support on this, both in terms of contributing content, but disseminating it widely to try and get a truly global set of civil society scanners involved in this. Then we will wrap up the formal aspect of the programme and the recording. Wolfgang, who's the director of the centre, will make some closing remarks. And then after that, we'll move into an informal interactive process to identify potential trend intersections, which smaller groups of organisations on the call may want to collaborate together on to generate new content for when we gather again in the autumn. So you are welcome to, we will have a formal close in 60 minutes, and some of you are welcome to leave then. So moving to the first part of the agenda, I'm really pleased that Michael and Mandeep took up our challenge to share some of the interesting shifts that they're seeing on areas that they're working on futures of civic space and climate action. And these should also hopefully be useful thought provocations and prompts for our later conversations on what we might want to work on together. So I am going to, Mandeep will start, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A with him, and then we'll move on to Michael's presentation.
Thanks, Vicky.
Let me just get your presentation up.
Okay, and hello everyone. Greetings from New York. I'm just working with Vicky to get my presentation up. There it is. So hope everyone's doing well. These are, of course, strange times, and also something that highlight, the enhanced importance of the work that we do. So maybe we could go to the first slide, and yeah, that's it. So the topic that I've been asked to speak of today is about civic space, and what the signals of change will be on civic space going forward. And maybe we could take a step back and just speak a little bit about what really is civic space. Civic space is the bedrock of an open and democratic society. It's the space that allows us to communicate, to organize, and to shape the political and social structures around us. It's essential for the work of civil society organizations, and oftentimes is used interchangeably with civil society enabling environment and so on. But most importantly, it hinges on 3 core civic freedoms: the freedoms of association, peaceful assembly, and expression. These 3 freedoms are a part of international law. They are enshrined in the constitutions of most countries. We measure civic space through a participatory platform, which is a research partnership with over 20 organizations around the world called the Civicus Monitor. And every year, we publish a report which details the landscape of civic space around the world. So I'm going to share some highlights from that report today, and of course reflecting on what the new situation is that we are faced with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you see that map, which is on your screen, we measure civic space according to 5 categories, ranging from open to closed. And so it's a nuanced picture of civic space that we seek to provide you. And you'll see those red categories, that's the closed categories. These are countries where there's absolutely no space for civil society to operate. And then this is, of course, the darker green category, which is countries where you are still able to speak truth to power. you were still able to, to organize freely and challenge the social and, and political and economic structures around you. That said, it's not that these countries don't have their own challenges. They still have civic space challenges. Could we go to the next slide, please, Vicky? So, according to our findings, only 3% of the world's population living in some 43 countries actually have adequate civic space that's guaranteed according to international law. And that's a matter of serious concern for us. This was even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. So, and remains a big challenge. And if you look at the bottom three categories, closed, repressed, obstructed, those make up 111 countries around the world. And we measure civic space in all the countries around the world, that is all UN member states, plus Kosovo, Palestine, and Taiwan. So it's a real worrying picture that existed even pre-COVID. And of course, post-COVID, we have even greater challenges, which I'll just delve into now in the next slide. So, given the challenges from COVID, a number of governments have been asked to, or have been asked to balance civic freedoms with public safety, and unfortunately, this balance is tilting in favor of so-called public safety concerns, and oftentimes away from civic freedoms, which anyway impacts public safety. So, according to our colleagues at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, in over 80 countries, emergency measures have been introduced, which with themselves bring serious challenges with regards to civic space. Law enforcement agencies in many parts of the world have also assumed greater powers, as we saw pictures in Kenya where police were beating up protesters and acting brutally for those whom they thought were not adhering to the lockdown. There's enhanced censorship in countries like Vietnam. Facebook bloggers and people who've been engaging on social media have been summoned to police stations because of their critical comments against the government. In a more democratic environment like South Africa, circulars have been issued by the government asking that false information with regards to COVID-19 should not be spread, which in itself has serious implications with regards to censorship. In other countries like India and China, in the name of contact tracing, surveillance apps have been developed, which could have serious implications on the right to privacy, but also on civic space and the right to organize and to challenge power holders. And in addition, in countries like Iran, people who have spoken out against the government response have been put into prison. They've been subjected to all sorts of criminal charges. In Pakistan, when doctors and health workers were protesting against the lack of protective gear, they've also been attacked. So and of course, media persons, journalists remain at serious risk in countries like Venezuela and the Democratic Republic of Congo, but even in countries like Colombia, where already there were challenges that rural activists faced, where there were challenges of assassinations of activists. Under the lockdown measures, there's even more risks for them. And of course, then there are political prisoners and activists in prison in many parts of the world, including in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Egypt, in Bahrain, who remain at serious risk of contracting COVID-19 due to the attitude of the authorities. And in Bahrain, while several prisoners have been released, human rights defenders like Nabil Rajab, who's the head of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, still has not been released, and all he did was criticize the authorities' response in tweets, and that remains a serious challenge for us. But anyway, I just wanted to lay out a few issues that perhaps could be important for us just to reflect on going forward with regards to civic space. In the next slide. So I think the big challenge for us really is that, the current emergency measures, the current states of lockdown, what implications are they going to have on democratic processes? How is it going to, how are authoritarian leaders going to repurpose them, or even our political parties that, that are in power, are they going to engage in voter suppression and in and in ensuring that democratic processes tilt in their favor? So I think that's something we really need to watch for. Again, COVID-19 measures have shown us that migrant workers, informal laborers, peasant groups are really at risk, and civil society organizations that are taking up their rights, and including LGBTQI activists and LGBTQI communities have been put at great risk. So we really need to keep an eye on that. Again, if you look at 2019, we had a wave of public protests, both against economic injustice and also against lack of democratic freedoms, from Chile to Lebanon to India to Hong Kong, and many of these mobilizations have been disrupted. In fact, in some countries, even the leaders of these mobilizations under the have been persecuted as the world's attention has been turned towards COVID-19 responses and public safety. So that's something that we really need to worry about. And the last thing that I really wanted to raise is that there is a real push towards censorship. There's a real push, and sometimes it's towards, in more benign ways, saying that we need to protect the public from false information, from fake news, and so on. And that's again, that's going hand in hand with contact tracing apps and so on. So there's a surveillance, and a lot of civil society struggles have moved online too, which brings its serious challenges. And in the post 9/11 scenario, we saw the normalization of torture, we saw the normalization of extraordinary renditions, and we really need to make sure that censorship and overarching surveillance don't become the outcomes of the current states of emergency that we are seeing around the world. And then the last slide, I'm mindful of time. I've just raised a few issues that we could focus on as civil society. We really need to demand a human rights approach to all emergency measures. International law says that any restrictions on fundamental freedoms should be necessary, they should be proportional, and they should be in accordance with the standards and practices expected in a democratic society. So that's something that we really need to continue to hold decision makers to account for. States of emergency have a tendency to linger long after the emergency has passed. So I think that's something that we again need to continue to advocate for, that these states of emergency should be withdrawn as soon as possible. The powers that law enforcement agencies have assumed should go back to normal ways of working as our societies and our economies link back to normalcy. It's important that as civil society we have a seat at the policy making table. A lot of governments are consulting experts and others, but there are some challenges with civil society participation in the policy making, and it's really critical that we have a seat at the table to make sure that the rights of the excluded are included in decision making and policy making processes, but also to make sure that civic freedoms are not further eroded in the current scenario. And also we need to make a strong case for multilateralism. There is some momentum on multilateralism. The UN Secretary General has issued a very strong call for centering COVID-19 responses in the human rights discourse, where he speaks about civic space and the value of civil society. There's also many governments have come and talked about the need to support multilateralism for trade certainty, and other governments have come forward to support multilateralism for development purposes, including debt relief and packages to the global south. And yet we need to make sure that these calls for multilateralism should also take into account multilateralism for upholding human rights standards, which are part of customary international law. And lastly, I think there's a real call to ourselves as civil society, as we all face these challenges, is to prioritize solidarity. Some organizations have more resources than others. Some organizations have better access to digital tools and so on. And if really there's a time for sharing and for supporting each other, it's now. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks very much, Mandeep. We've got a couple of minutes now for questions or comments. So I think we're probably a small enough group that if you would like to say something, could you just type your name in the chat and then I will come to you and you can ask your question directly. Doesn't look like there are any immediate questions, Mandeep, which sounds like everyone agrees with what you've said. Here we go, Mitoni. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Mandeep. I have a question about your point number 3, seeking a seat at the policy-making table. What does that look like in real life? Because is this about influencing legislators? Is this about influencing corporations that are going to be basically making life and death choices depending on what they decide to do with vaccines? What does that look like? Just if you could expand on that. Thank you.
Yes, I think you really hit the nail on the head. It looks at influencing a wide range of actors. But more importantly, what has been really worrying is that many presidents and prime ministers have put together COVID-19 response teams. And these teams usually have health experts. They usually have CEOs of big businesses, but they're not reaching out to civil society as much, perhaps because civil society would ask them to take some uncomfortable decisions and also perhaps shine a spotlight on the lack of action. So it's really critical at this point of time that, as migrant workers, as as LGBTQI communities and others are suffering, that we are somehow make a compelling case, or maybe even push for having that door open to a wide range of voices, because the discourse between public safety and economic rights and livelihoods is a real challenging one, and the tendency so far has been to lapse back into middle class concerns by many of the policymakers, perhaps because of whom they're consulting.
Great, thanks. So we have a comment from Nicole from Wikimedia, and then a question from Antonia, and then we'll go with Michael. Thanks. Nicole, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. And because it's a comment, I try to make it short, because questions are probably more important. Civic space is needed more than ever. I completely agree. It's like in this time, like super important. But I see this challenge, like how do we make sure that those who how can we be super careful who's actually going to or wanting to join this cause and so on? Because in Germany, for example, we have all these conspiracy theorists on the rise at the moment who like say, okay, all these measures are too strong, and like they try to advocate in the name of the civic space or civil society, but basically draw the attention of like many right-wing and fascist people to their cause and so on. And like, how do we counter, how do we find countermeasures and ensure that everything like we also do in the civic space, or people who join us, really base their activities or their measures and so on really fact-based information and so on. Just I'm seeing this on the rise, and that scares me a lot. Thanks.
Mandeep, did you want to comment quickly on that, or should we move straight to the question from Antonia?
Should we take? I can comment on that, but let's take both the questions and then I can
Sure. Go ahead, Antonia, please.
So hi, Mandeep. I'm Antonia from Alliance 2015, and thanks for a really fascinating and troubling, but also constructive presentation. So I've got 2 questions. Do you have any reflections on adjustments to our language, which is helpful? Because, I mean, to me, when I listen to you and I see your presentation, you use a language which I think we're all very familiar with and very comfortable with. And one of my worries might be that this language is sometimes and maybe increasingly not effective in some circles. For example, talking about human rights-based approaches can be just a complete turn off. And there may be another way to get to this without using, I mean, we can speak directly like this between ourselves, but I would just love to hear a little bit more your reflection on what can be new and useful twists on language which don't sell out what we're actually trying to do, because I think it's important not to state that everything is a win-win. And then my second was just a question about your fundamental point about solidarity, much easier spoken of than achieved. And I just wondered, given your encyclopedic knowledge from a civicist perspective, do you have some favorite recent examples of this kind of solidarity that might inspire us, but also that we could use in trying to drum up solidarity in the spaces where we're operating? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for those questions. So perhaps maybe I'll start with the one on uncivil society. And that, Nicole, is a serious issue, which is, you know, the rise of anti-rights groups that don't believe in justice and rights values. And that's something that exists and obviously gets heightened. So one approach that we've taken in our work is to support those organizations and groups that believe in universal declaration of human rights values, you know, that are there. And that's one way to sift through that. It's of course difficult because everybody doesn't know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and probably may not have such a nuanced understanding, but that might be one way and to do so. But we really need to start to do that, because, you know, the traditional definition of civil society being outside the market, the state and the family could be applied to the Ku Klux Klan on one extreme, or Al-Qaeda, or, you know, on one extreme, but also to more subtle ways of like the National Rifle Association and things like that, who could claim to be, you know, to have that space. But we really need to make that connection much stronger. On adjustments to language, yes, that's definitely, I mean, a serious issue amongst particularly organized civil society. The language that we use can oftentimes be exclusionary, and we really need to be able to, you know, to tap into discourses as a strategic priority, see what language and, you know, that leaders are using, and perhaps what resonates, you know, in regions and sub-regions and so on, and that's a really important point to make, and even where possible, you know, link to local standards, local you know, local culture, I would say. On solidarity, you know, given that we are with a bunch of international NGOs here, I would really say one of the things that we've been pushing at Civicus is to make sure that as much resources, as high a percentage of resources reaches organizations on the ground that's meant for development aid is something that we really believe in very strongly, and that really is an important aspect of solidarity, to make sure that, you know, our supply chains are as agile as possible, and there's as little seepage of development aid as there's a tendency for politicians to repurpose development aid to ways that, you know, that aid their own political objectives. But of course, around the world, there have been, you know, there've been solidarity actions, and, you know, some of the actions that have been taking place around health workers, you know, rights, and to celebrate, you know, the essential workers who, you know, who are paid very less in society, in normal societies, people who are, you know, who are manning or womaning, or you know, people who are basically who look after the grocery stores and essential services, and that really is that some of that solidarity is starting to emerge, and also to emphasize that, you know, that it doesn't mean how much, you know, person's value should not be judged by how much they earn, and also cause for higher wages for them.
Thanks, Mandeep. On the case studies in particular, I'd also like to mention some work that we've been doing with our Solidarity Action Network. We've just put out a series of case studies on coalition responses and also organisational resilience mechanisms. So we'll make sure that we share those with you, and also the Resilient Roots case studies as well, a couple which featured in our innovation report last year. So those are all excellent case studies for solidarity and resilience, if that's what you're looking for in particular. I know a couple of you did want to make some comments and and there was like a hand raised, but just to stick to time, I'm going to say thank you to Mandeep there and move on now to Michael's presentation from MobLab. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And
we'll try to share mine.
Try and share yours. Yeah, that's working. Great. Yeah.
Great.
So go ahead. Thanks.
Never know. All right. Should I just jump right in then?
Yes, go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good to be here with you. So I've met some of you, but I'm here in Washington, D.C. The MobLab team is all over the world, and our mission is to help campaigners like all of us here stay at the cutting edge of what's working. And so we particularly love spaces like this where we can learn from one another, accelerate that learning, but most importantly, figure out what is going to be most effective as organizations adapt to this constantly changing landscape. And so we do a lot of training, capacity building, workshops, and had a chance to, this was a fun exercise for us to look into what's changing specifically within climate. I will touch briefly on some, when we look at systems change, we're always looking at multiple layers. And so the stuff that perhaps is most interesting, I'll say to me at least, is at the end. I'll talk about what's happening, I think, within society and social action. But I do want to start with just a couple things. I am far from an expert on either of the political or economic layers, but there's a few data points I think worth putting into the conversation, as I know this conversation is going to lead to some additional thinking about scenarios. So the things that have jumped out to me so far when we think about what's the future of climate action, first, I think we've seen a lot of interesting data about how emissions are dramatically down during COVID. And that's not just because so many people are staying at home or not going to offices, or sorry, it's largely due to the changes in our society, but the idea is that this might be a permanent drop, right? That we may have actually hit peak fossil fuels last year. From all the economic analyses that I'm seeing, there's almost no chance for oil and gas to recover at the same pace. And so this is a huge implication, obviously, for climate action. If oil is in long-term trouble, how do we ensure that it is permanently in trouble? How do we make this a permanent tipping point towards clean energy and renewables and a clean energy society? So that leads to a lot of the Build Back Better campaigns that we're starting to see. I think my understanding is Build Back Better is more what we're seeing in Europe. In the US, we're seeing a lot of advocacy around a Green New Deal or green recovery. So lots of opportunity on this, how we set the political agenda for our economy for decades forward. There was one analyst talking about how in the global financial crisis in 2008, they put some 16% of stimulus money towards green initiatives, and that was wholly insufficient. So that's just one data point we can think about from a climate policy, environmental policy perspective. But overall, there's a lot of work that many of you are either part of or aware of, probably, about influencing these massive government stimulus packages in different countries. They look different everywhere. Towards, there's multiple interests fighting at this moment, right, about what goes in there. And so I think that's probably the front lines of the policy fight right now. And I think one narrative is the last point here that I want to flag is I think there's an interesting conversation evolving and some narrative research being done to test this out, but there's a risk that we divorce. I think there's been a lot of good work in the last decade or so to ensure that we're talking about climate justice and the human impacts of climate change. And there's a kind of, with all the different memes and initiative, you know, as we see these photos of clear sky, there's some of you probably have seen some of these narratives around the people are resting so the earth can heal. Some of these comments in line, or memes in line with that, and I think there's a danger there in divorcing and kind of pitting people versus the planet, right? People who need to get back to work, right? The human toll of COVID as being something that you know, that we can't go back to, that people can't go back to work or make a livelihood, that it's at the expense of the environment or the planet, and which I think is a danger for us. So Mandeep already, you know, covered so much of this, right? But there's obviously a direct implication on climate action if activists and social change makers and campaigners don't have the ability to advocate, communicate, organize. Obviously, there's a lot of, I think we've all probably seen interesting new initiatives, how to organize online, how to mobilize people using new digital tactics, or organizations trying to get savvier, faster about how to leverage digital. But I think that maybe the key thing to note here is this is not just about people in favor of climate action trying to move an agenda. At the same time, we have you know, oil industries looking to, you know, some of the roll back plastic bag bans and take advantage of a moment like this to when there's a destabilization, it's an opportunity for everyone to try to grab power. So obviously we're seeing that on the, you know, how are authoritarians doing that, but that's also happening from a climate and energy agenda perspective. I'll end this section on a bit of hope. We're seeing, I think, our cities being very quick. We started, I think, these 3 days talking about the built infrastructure, and which is a term I hadn't come across, but you know, it makes sense here. We're seeing complete overhauls to how cities work, and many of them, when it comes to, you know, closing off miles and kilometers of roads to increase pedestrian access, to increase bike, scooter access, alternative, sustainable transportation options, and more importantly, perhaps government starting to offer tax credits. I think in Germany, it was something like 3,000 euro for a new car, but 5,000 euro tax credit for an electric vehicle. Another data point is some parts of the UK seeing something like a 70% rise in bike traffic. So fortunately, I think we're starting to see authorities try to encourage that trend. And so the question, I think, for climate action, how do we ensure that some of these temporary shifts in our infrastructure become permanent shifts, right? And again, continue to accelerate that shift towards a clean energy economy. Let's see. Yeah, Seattle just announced that some of their temporary street changes are now going to be permanent. There's a, you know, again, in the UK, £2 billion investment in cycling and walking. So these are exciting trends. Question for those in campaigning: how do we make those permanent? So the people there, you know, climate action involves people power. That's what we most focus on and get most excited about. So I want to share a couple points on that now, and starting with where are the people at on this linkage between climate change and coronavirus. I think there's a lot of signs of hope here. Just let you take a look at the chart. You know, I think to me what this is showing is that we are seeing it's possible to mount a collective response to an invisible threat. So the link here between COVID and climate is that they're, you know, both ostensibly invisible to most people. This is not it's not like a hurricane or a tornado that you can visibly see coming down, on the horizon, and you have to take shelter for. These are actions we took to restrain our activities out of a collective, collaborative understanding of what we would need to address this invisible threat. And so, fortunately, we're seeing people making this link between climate change and as something that is as severe for our future as COVID. And so again, the question for climate action, is how do we solidify, how do we make this linkage, how do we appropriately run with this momentum, or maintain, if people are seeing now the ability to make dramatic changes, for one thing, how are we willing to do that for another thing? Another data point on here, I skipped adding anything about, I think it's almost self-evident at this point to say that we have youth at the front of the climate fight around the world. In the US, there was one study that 85% of millennials actually say that they are involved in fighting climate action. So I think we are seeing some shifts in people's participation in climate action. And one of the, actually, I think, Vicky, you sent me a report on a study in the UK, 71% agreeing with the idea that we need a global response to a global problem, that we're all in this together. So starting to see these linkages between climate as a global challenge we need to tackle as collaboratively and globally as coronavirus. Second, connected to this, as trust in government responses around the world goes down, I think we're seeing an increase in people's belief in people power, or in other words, as it says in the bottom, in the middle here, people are seeing how their behavior directly changes a larger system. So individual behavior impacting a larger system. And these are positive feedback loops, right? They're seeing, it's not just flattening, if we can flatten a curve, can we flatten the climate curve? This is a chart from an illustration from a good article by Otto Scharmer at the Presencing Institute, which I think in part makes this point as well. And yeah, I'm particularly inspired by all the mutual aid initiatives and community responses that have been at the front lines of the response, essentially, right? In addition to, of course, healthcare workers, we're seeing that the most effective and immediate solutions for most people in most places have been through the community level responses. And I would argue that this is giving us a chance to rebuild civic muscles. So perhaps this follows on nicely from Mandeep's presentation. But I think the level of increased activity that we see with people taking what I would argue is a political action in getting involved in their communities, in civic action, right? Is strengthening our civic muscles to do additional work. And what we see, I think Rebecca Solnit wrote about this over a decade ago, in these moments of disasters and crisis, there's a knock-on effect where, organizing, she cites a great example in Mexico City after the earthquake, where tenant groups who were working with each other and doing mutual and organizing then played a role in the transition to a democratic government later on. And we see that we've seen a lot of examples of this, people in Occupy who go on to work in the US here in political elections, people who were involved, were trained in climate movement here, then going on to be key leaders in March for Our Lives, or inspired by, gun violent social movement work. So her point being, right, the organizing and activism we see now in community response and mutual aid efforts that are spawning all over is, I think, a sign of hope, leading to hopefully more organizing and activism and climate action or other political action, especially again, as people see, we're going to have to, as coronavirus is proving the point to more people, that we're going to have to take these crises into our own hands and can't rely and wait for others. And I think this is my final one here, but some of you may have hopefully seen this as a great project emerging from Erica Chenoweth and colleagues that is tracking all the forms of nonviolent action, citizen action, activism. You know, activism is alive and well during the pandemic. I think, you know, it's definitely a false narrative to say that, you know, just because people aren't in the streets, activism is down. Or obviously there's a lot of retooling and stepping back and asking, how do we do our campaigns in this moment? Every organization we work with or partner with is doing that step back to say, hey, we can't just talk about climate the way we were, or we can't talk about whatever we were doing the way we were before the pandemic. But activism is alive and well. And so this is a cool project tracking all the many ways people are organizing, and again, signs of hope, in my opinion, for the future of climate action. And I think that is where I will leave it. Yeah, thank you.
Super, thanks, Michael. I like the balance between seeds of hope and with some of the seeds of perhaps fear or despair that we had a bit earlier, but definitely a common theme around innovation and mobilization and activism coming across strongly from both you and Mandeep. So we've got a couple more comments and now, so Chris from Community Action, do you want to come in with your question around dress rehearsals?
Thank you, and good afternoon from Athens. This is something that I keep hearing from many sides, trying to establish a link between the pandemic and the climate change crisis. As if, and I use a metaphor, the COVID crisis is a sort of dress rehearsal for any future climate change crisis. This has an assumption that we make that the COVID crisis is just a passing time of exception and nothing deeper. I think that we have to question this and also to think carefully for advocacy, for campaigning. If we learned something, for instance, we will get out as societies, as communities wiser, with politicians willing to listen to the scientists and take actions, or in a very negative scenario, as Naomi Klein pointed out in The Guardian last week with her article, the updated shock doctrine, fetishizing GDP in a rush for growth, rebounding as soon as possible. I like to stay optimistic, but I also want to do a proper intellectual exercise and to come up with the deeper layers that may help us face the climate change crisis effectively as societies, as communities, as organizations, to get inventive and creative and use on the knowledge we acquired from this global emergency that we are still in the middle of. Thank you.
Thanks. Mutoni, I think you had a quick comment as well, and then Michael, you can answer those, and then we'll move on to the final session. Mutoni, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually had a question for Michael, not a comment. So Build Back Better suggests that you're reconstructing something that was there and increasing its efficiency. And I noticed that in the survey you had world, that I assume includes Asia, Africa, and Latin America as one, and then OECD countries that are specified. And my question to Michael is, you know, there's a huge assumption being made with Build Back Better that electricity, infrastructure for transport, all of this exists. It's been affected by the pandemic, and now we need to Build Back Better. There's such a huge assumption in that campaign. And I think that it's a cop-out, that it's easy to say that, it sounds good, it fits well on banners, but what does it actually mean if you are sitting in Kenya, there's been a flood, there's been a locust invasion of biblical proportions, there's the pandemic, closing civil society space. What does that actually mean when we say build back better? So my question to Michael is, what are you seeing in terms of examples of organizing outside of OECD countries that can lend itself to real engagement and creating space for civil society in the big bunch that was titled as World in your survey? Thanks.
Great, thanks, Matoni. So Michael, can you come in on those 2 points, please? That's great.
Sure, I think I'll mainly focus on I agree with Chris. I didn't catch if there's a question there as much as I appreciated the comment. Chris, that was insightful. Matoni, yeah, I'm sorry if it sounded like I was waving a flag to endorse Build Back Better, as much as I agree with your assumption or how you're framing it. And as Arati, I think in the chat here is saying as well. I think it's a campaign. I think it's some campaign slogan. You know, there's different language. Like here in the U.S., I think we're talking more about a Green New Deal, which is completely rethinking aspects of the economy. And when I dig into some of the, what does this mean? Economists have, I think, there's 6 different approaches. There's a gap between what's being touted as, campaign slogan and then actual a wide range of details for what we're actually talking about in terms of what industries are getting propped up, what systemic inequalities or oppression is getting addressed or not. And so I think it's one of those, I don't have a great answer or comment here as much as to say, I agree. And I think, yeah, that chart is ridiculous if it's grouping, if it's saying OECD and world. So yeah, my goal in sharing that was more just the general linkage of, is there a connection here that we can make between climate and yeah, I think there's going to be in other countries, how do we, there are creative solutions. I think part of the value of a network like this is starting to talk about what are the creative solutions, what is a Puerto Rico distributed energy grid solution looking like, or in one place that can be applied to another place if we're talking about a true global collaboration on say climate policy. But to me, it's like, what is the window? There is a the key thing, I guess, for me that is going to shift in each country as the political timeline shifts is, what is the window of opportunity? What is the political window of opportunity that we need to seize as campaigners for social justice that we may miss as our opponents and advocates are maybe even more aggressively seizing this moment, as we're also busy doing community care and other important things and potentially making our agenda harder to achieve in 5 years when certain things have been locked in without us paying enough attention, perhaps. So some thoughts, but I totally agree with the premise of your question.
Super, thanks Michael, thanks Mandeep. Thank you very much for the way you interpreted the challenge around signals of change. I think it's given us inspiration as we present what we're hoping to do, get everyone doing a bit of this. So Arati and I will talk a bit about our plans for what we would like everyone to chip in on for our kind of over the next few months, which is this collective scanning exercise of signals for the sector relating to post-COVID-19. So Arati, do you want to kind of come in on the introduction?
Yep. Hi, Vicky. Hi, everybody. Nice to be back again. I have to apologize. They're crazily doing some construction work right outside my window, so there might be some background noise. Okay, just really quickly, I know we are short on time. And I suppose, you know, we've talked, yesterday we were talking a lot about how do we come together in a much more collective way. And even earlier today, somebody was talking about what is the role at the table for civil society actors, and how do we, you know, what does that actually look like? And so what Vicky and I were talking about was an initiative around how do we build our collective intelligence around what might the nudges of all, what might all these signals of change, all these converging complexities, these converging uncertainties that we're seeing, what does it point to? And we're all familiar, I'm assuming here, with, you know, doing your basic horizon scan, you know, doing any kind of horizon scanning, doing any scanning process for signals. We're trying to push that a little bit further here to draw on the power of collective intelligence, of taking an approach of larger than us rather than individual us, and to look at what we can understand around the nudges, the levers, and the collective narrative that is being weaved. If you can just maybe change the slide, Vicky. So new normals. So what is the new normal? And new normals are also being vastly contested, is just the same phrase as build back better. So are we moving into a new normal? What might that look like? Or is the new normal going to exacerbate all the inequalities in the broken systems that have existed? And what might the trends that we're seeing, the signals that we're seeing, paint the story, paint weave the sort of collective futures of what could be? And therefore, where is the role for us as institutions, as individuals, as citizens, as actors within that, to understand what we want to react to in the short term, what we want to manage in the medium term, or what we might want to influence and prepare for in the long term. Just the next slide, please, Vicky. So here are some really quick examples, and I've drawn this from, I've just recently run this process with 3 humanitarian agencies, ICRC, UNHCR, and MSF, and we ran them with their staff across all the 3 different agencies together, across multiple geographies. It was the first time that members of these organizations, of these agencies, had come together on a collective intelligence, or any kind of project that wasn't determined by a project to begin with, as in a project output, a project outcome. It was genuinely a process to unearth what we were all uncertain about, and where those signals that people were seeing from, and whether we could find the patterns across different agencies and across different geographies. So here are some examples that we pulled up. Immunity passports, the impacts on migrant workers, ironically, as Singapore was saying that they had it all under control. Next slide, please, Vicky. Amsterdam ditching the economic growth model, embracing Kate Raworth's donut model. Portugal treating migrants and asylum seekers as residents. These are just some very, very broad signals that we can see. And obviously, one of the benefits of doing a collective intelligence, collective signals gathering process, hopefully from people in your organizations that are at multiple levels and at different geographies, is we're going to get a really diverse range of signals that people are seeing or resonating with that is broader than what their institutional mandate might be. Next slide, please. So we're driven by this question, what are you critically uncertain about? Very often we're designing our responses or our planning based on certainty. We don't build uncertainty, as we know, into our governance systems. And so Vicky's already started a process to sort of narrow down the sort of clusters of what we're uncertain about. And we're going to gather signals against those particular clusters to help us understand. Next slide. I'm going to get Vicky to talk about this a little bit more because she ran a survey, but just before we go into that, I just want to come back around the strengths of doing a collective participatory process to this. it may unearth signals that we are familiar with already. It may not unearth anything particularly new, but it's the nuance that is what we're looking for. And we're also looking at how many people are saying or speaking of or identifying the same issues. It's those clusters, those strengths against particular signals that speak to this, I suppose, the importance of it and how loudly it's coming across. It helps build an evidence base, both quantitative and qualitative, and gets us to maybe just hopefully take our blinkers off a little bit, institutional blinkers, to have a much wider range of data sets we might consider. I'll stop there and I'll hand back to Vicky just to talk about some of these clusters of uncertainties.
Thanks, Arathi. Yeah, so I mean, the other advantage about this being a truly open source exercise is that you will also have access to the same database, and you will be able to see everyone's signals as they're contributing. And so really making that a networked approach and reaching out to our networks to try and get as many organizations and perspectives scanning would be great. So these are the results of the survey that you will have received various communications from us about. We had 40 responses, which was really helpful in just helping us establish some kind of indication around what are the big uncertainties that we did want to collectively track signals under. So of the, there was a kind of group of 4, so vulnerability and equality, combating climate change, civic space, and global cooperation, that definitely came out as areas that we would, like the top most popular areas where we would want to track signals under. Then there was another group around public perceptions of states, institutions and CSOs, conflict and fragility, livelihoods in its broadest sense, including income and employment, changing societal values, and food security and systems. And so I would suggest that these are the 9 uncertainties that we will include for the signals mapping. There were 3 other areas that we included within the survey, which really didn't attract as much kind of interest. That was global geopolitics and economics, migration and public health. That was significantly lower voted, so I would propose excluding those. A couple of other interesting uncertainties that were mentioned was trust in and availability of fact-based information and intergeneral relations, but perhaps those areas that we can incorporate under the other 9. So back to Arathi, this is exactly what the process will actually look like under these broad 9 questions of the critical uncertainties. And so this is the kind of questions that would be asked for someone filling in a signal or a detail of a signal.
Right. So we're going to be launching this in June. And Vicky can talk about some of the logistics around that. We'll have it open for a couple of months. And just in terms of getting as much participation in it as possible. We'll be recording the signals on Airtable. It's fairly intuitive, easy to use. It is not anonymous. I will have to flag that. We will see your name. Or when you register for Airtable, you can use a different name if that's what you prefer. We don't care about who is entering the information. We just care about the data. But I am flagging that we will see your name or whatever your name you register with. It's a fairly you will be able to see everything gathered at the same time, which is fantastic. Here's an example of what I've pulled from doing this with in the humanitarian space. So the first line is what the title is, you describe it. We're asking people to think about why that particular signal or issue is important, and how might the sector respond. I'll just switch that last category. The reference and an image, if you like, if you would like to put an image next to it. So it's really, really straightforward and fairly easy to use, and we'll send the links out to everybody just before the campaign gets launched. I think that's it, Vicky. Yeah. Yep.
So there are multiple potential sources. Signals come from anywhere, basically. So anything that you're hearing, anything that you're scanning. We will provide some guidance to people when we launch the process, which will include these are some of the sources that you can look at. So we will be launching this on the 1st of June. It will be coming soon to a screen near you, as is everything else at the moment. So please keep posted and please think about who in your organisation might be able to engage and who in your networks as well. So with this, I would like to hand over to Wolfgang, who's the director of the centre, just for some closing remarks, just to finish the formal aspects of the programme before we move into the collaborative conversations. Go ahead, please, Wolfgang.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Arathi. So that's a bit breathtaking, obviously, and it doesn't really feel like we're at a point of closing remarks. Well, this is a conversation that is not just starting, but going to continue over the next couple of months. So apologies for a bit of an abrupt change or stop of what I found was quite an inspirational 3 days or 3 sessions. I will refrain from trying any smart remarks around trends and futures, particularly in the light of so many highly qualified experts in this virtual room. Let me just share that I incredibly enjoy such opportunities for exchange and learning, particularly in times of high pressure of delivery and operational responses. I'm sure that's been shared by many colleagues in this virtual room. When I look at the usefulness of such meetings, at the end of the day, it needs to make our job better. It needs to help us perform better. And there's a couple of questions that came up over the last couple of days for me. First of all, by doing this, do we understand the world better? Listening to the insights, also particularly around the interconnectedness of trends, because that was the overriding theme. Both you, Arathi, and I think a few others yesterday at the OECD used the term of critical uncertainties. So that, uncertainties, do they make us understand the world better? Intuitively, maybe the opposite. The more uncertain I get, the more difficult it might be. But on the other hand, I think we had another quote out there around the messiness. Yes, we realize these situations that we're dealing with are messy, but there's also some necessary messiness that we just have to accept and have to deal with. So in terms of, do we understand the world better? Yes, definitely we are getting more pieces of information and insights that help us analyze better. Are we good enough in doing this? Clearly, listening to the last 3 days, I would say no. 1 or 2 recurrent comments that came in were around the need to broaden our perspectives, bringing both voices from inside, but more so outside the sectors as into our foresighting and analysis. A third danger that was mentioned a couple of times is the danger of focusing on the things that we prefer to see, whether it's utopias or whether it's dystopias. I mean, we also know that sometimes it's very convenient to focus on a dystopian development because then you can be stronger with your argument. And this might even carry the danger of reinforcing things we stand for through selective analysis. It was mentioned a couple of times, maybe it's not a very comfortable thought, but the fact alone that we have these reflections and that we had the reflections over the last couple of days over some of those potentially uncomfortable truths already show that we are progressing in doing a better job. I think that for me is one of the biggest takeaways, the self-reflection, the critical dialogue here. So I think, and that's another quote, we're doing much more than enjoying foresighting as a social process. Yes, we've been a community, we've been socializing with each other over foresighting, but clearly there's more happening than just kind of this kind of collective engaging in those critical thoughts. There's a big, I think, ask for all of us. I think that we've realized that we need to develop more confidence and courage to adapt our actions to the analysis that we're providing, and not vice versa. We heard that a couple of times, and it's partly our job, but it's partly, of course, in the hand of many in the sectors. But adapting, being adaptive in terms of what we do to what we see, I think is the way ahead. I want to thank everyone for being in these discussions, particularly those who actively contributed, who co-facilitated, and of course, Vicky and her team, and Ryan behind the screen, making this such a pleasant experience. This is something that will continue, and obviously there's something planned for September, maybe half virtual, maybe hybrid, maybe fully virtual. I'm looking forward to this, and I hope that all of you will be back on board then. Thank you very much.